Imagine wading through knee-deep mud every day, barefoot or wrapped in scraps of wool, if you were lucky. In the medieval world, socks were a luxury and clean, dry feet. A distant dream. Tonight, we trudge gently through the muddy lanes of Peasant. Life where cold toes, blisters, and squelching footsteps were just part of the daily struggle. And nobody complained because there wasn't time to. If stories of skoggy forgotten struggles help you sink deeper into your cozy blankets, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon for more sleepy tales from history's wet, muddy, and uncomfortable corners. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You are standing at the threshold of a medieval English village in the year 1287. And the first thing that strikes you isn't the sight or the sound, it's the squelch beneath your feet. The mud here isn't merely an inconvenience, it's a permanent resident, as much a part of daily life as the wooden spoon in your hand or the rough wool against your skin. This mud has personality, character, and an almost malicious persistence that defines every aspect of peasant existence. The village stretches before you in a collection of small, cramped structures that seem to emerge from the earth itself. Each house tells the same story of resourceful desperation, walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that has been painstakingly applied over wooden frames. These walls aren't just built with mud, they're born from it, shaped by hands that know no other building material is within their reach or means. Inside these homes, the floors tell an even more intimate story of humanity's relationship with mud. There are no wooden planks, no stone tiles, no luxury of separation between the inhabitants and the earth below. See Dale Britton's blog. The floors are simply dirt-packed earth that has been swept so vigorously over the years that archaeological evidence shows many peasant homes actually sit below ground level. Families literally wore away their floors through daily maintenance, creating depressions that required visitors to step down to enter. But this isn't a story of resignation or defeat. These medieval peasants developed an intricate relationship with their muddy environment that bordered on the scientific. They understood moisture, drainage, and the seasonal rhythms of their soggy world with the precision of modern meteorologists. The mud in their floors wasn't just tolerated, was managed, controlled, and in some strange way, mastered. Consider the daily routine of Eleanor, a peasant woman whose name appears in Manor Court rolls from 1294. She rises before dawn in her single-room dwelling, her bare feet immediately making contact with the earthen floor that has been swept clean the evening before. The floor feels different each morning, sometimes hard and dusty, other times slightly damp from overnight humidity, occasionally soft and yielding when the autumn rains have found their way through the thatched roof or under the door. Eleanor knows exactly how her floor should feel. Too dry, and the dust becomes unbearable, coating everything and everyone in a fine layer of grit. Too wet, and the carefully maintained surface becomes a slippery, treacherous mud pit that makes every movement dangerous. She has developed an intuitive understanding of the perfect moisture level firm enough to walk on safely, but with just enough give to remain dust-free. The process of maintaining these earthen floors represented a daily negotiation with the forces of nature. Peasants would scatter fresh rushes and herbs across the surface, not merely for fragrance, but to absorb excess moisture and provide a barrier between their feet and the cold earth. These rushes had to be changed regularly as they became saturated with spilled food, tracked in rainwater, and the general detritus of daily life. But the real mastery lay in reading the subtle signs that indicated when the floor needed attention. A slightly sweet smell might indicate that organic matter was beginning to decompose in the floor, requiring immediate action to prevent the development of truly noxious odors. A dusty haze in the morning light meant the surface had become too dry and needed a light sprinkling of water. Footprints that remained visible long after someone had walked across the floor indicated that the earth had become too soft and needed to be packed down again. The tools for floor maintenance were simple but effective. A stiff broom made of birch. Twigs served for daily sweeping. Flat wooden paddles could be used to smooth and compact areas that had become uneven. In extreme cases, when sections of the floor had become hopelessly muddy, peasants would excavate the affected area and replace it with fresh earth, often mixed with straw or other binding materials to improve its durability. This wasn't work that could be postponed or ignored. A poorly maintained floor could become a health hazard, breeding ground for pests, or simply an unbearable living environment. The social implications were significant to peasant communities. Were small and close-knit, and a family that couldn't maintain their home properly would quickly find themselves a subject of gossip, or, worse, suspicion of laziness or moral failing. The seasonal challenges varied dramatically. Spring brought the double curse of melting snow and early rains, turning the carefully maintained floors into soggy messes that required constant attention. Summer offered a brief respite, but also brought its own problems, as the floors could become so dry they created dust storms with every footstep. Autumn meant preparation for winter sealing cracks, adding extra rushes, and ensuring that the floor could withstand months of minimal maintenance during the coldest. Period winter presented the greatest test of a peasant family's floor management. Skills with no central heating and only a single fire to warm the entire dwelling. The contrast between the warm areas near the hearth and the cold zones near the walls created complex moisture patterns. Condensation would form on the walls and drip onto the floor, creating muddy patches that were difficult to address. When fuel for fires was scarce and daylight hours were limited. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this relationship with mud was how it shaped the very rhythm of daily life. Every activity had to account for the condition of the floor. Cooking required careful placement of water containers to avoid spills that would create muddy patches. Sleeping arrangements had to consider the firmest, driest areas of the floor. Even social interactions where influenced visitors could tell immediately upon entering whether a household was well managed based on the condition of their earthen floor. The mud wasn't just underfoot. It was overhead and all around. The wattle and daub walls required regular maintenance as the mud-based mixture would crack and crumble with changes in temperature and humidity. Peasants became expert at reading these patterns, knowing exactly when a wall needed fresh daub applied, and which cracks were merely cosmetic versus those that threatened the structural integrity of their homes. But as Eleanor goes about her morning routine, carefully stepping across her well-maintained floor to tend the fire and begin preparing the day's first meal, one can't help but wonder, how did this intimate knowledge of mud and its management affect the mental landscape of medieval peasants? What thoughts occupied minds that spent so much time and energy simply managing the ground beneath their feet? The mud that peasants so carefully managed inside their homes was nothing compared to the vast, unforgiving expanse of mud that awaited them in the fields each day. Medieval agriculture wasn't simply farming, it was an ongoing battle against soil that seemed determined to resist every human effort to make it productive. The sticky, waterlogged earth clung to every tool, every boot, and every bare foot with what seemed like malicious intent. Picture William, a villain bound to the manor of Ashby in Leicestershire, as he approaches his assigned strip in the common field on a typical April morning in 1342. The previous night's rain has transformed what was already challenging terrain into a landscape that seems designed to test human endurance. Each step requires a conscious effort not just to move forward, but to extract his foot from the sucking grip of mud that reaches halfway up his leg. William's primary tool is a scratch plow, or ard, a device so primitive it barely deserves the name plow by modern standards. This wooden implement, occasionally reinforced with small pieces of iron if William is fortunate, must somehow penetrate and turn over soil that has the consistency of thick porridge. The physics of this endeavor are brutal. Each furrow requires William to drive the plow through resistant mud while simultaneously managing the ox that provides the power. But the ox presents its own challenges in these conditions. The animal's hooves sink deep into the soft earth, requiring enormous effort just to maintain forward momentum. The ox must work twice as hard to achieve half the normal progress, and William must constantly adjust his technique to account for the unpredictable footing. Sometimes the ox refuses to move at all, and William finds himself literally stuck in the middle of his field with a stubborn animal and a useless plow. The mud doesn't simply slow the work, fundamentally changes how every farming task must be approached. Sowing seed in muddy conditions becomes an exercise in precision and timing. Scatter the seed too early, and it sinks beneath the surface where it will rot. Wait too long for the mud to dry, and the planting season passes by. William must somehow find that perfect moment when the soil is still soft enough to work, but firm enough to support the seeds. Weeding becomes almost impossible in muddy conditions. The tools slip, the weeds come up in great clumps of mud that must be carried to field edges. And distinguishing between crops and weeds becomes difficult when everything is coated in the same brown slurry. William often finds himself crawling on hands and knees through the mud, pulling weeds individually process that leaves him covered from head to toe in a mixture of soil, plant matter, and his own sweat. The harvest presents its own muddy nightmare. Crops that have survived the growing season must be gathered before they spoil, regardless of field conditions. William and his family often find themselves harvesting grain while standing knee-deep in mud, trying to keep the precious crop clean and dry while their own feet disappear into the soft earth with every step. The scythe, their primary harvesting tool, becomes clogged with mud and plant matter, requiring constant cleaning that interrupts the urgent work of bringing in the crop. But perhaps the most exhausting aspect of working in these conditions is the sheer physical toll of constant movement through mud. Modern studies of energy expenditure show that walking through mud can require up to 3 times the energy of walking on firm ground. For medieval peasants who were already operating on minimal nutrition, this additional physical burden pushed many to the very limits of human endurance. William's typical day begins at dawn and continues until darkness makes further work impossible. In muddy conditions, tasks that might normally take a few hours can stretch into entire days. The constant struggle to maintain footing while performing complex physical tasks creates a level of fatigue that goes beyond simple tiredness. It's the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from fighting the earth itself. The social dynamics of agricultural work also changed in muddy conditions. The communal aspects of medieval farming, where villagers would work together on shared tasks, became more critical and more complicated. When the fields were muddy, no single person could accomplish much alone. Cooperative efforts became essential, but they also required careful coordination to avoid having multiple people stuck in the same muddy area simultaneously. Women and children played crucial roles in muddy fieldwork, often serving as the light-footed scouts who could navigate treacherous terrain to bring tools, food, and water to the men who were literally bogged down in the heavier work. Children became expert at reading field conditions, learning to identify which areas were safe to traverse and which would trap an adult. The tools themselves required constant maintenance in these conditions. Wooden implements would swell and warp when constantly wet, changing their balance and effectiveness. Iron tools, rare and precious, had to be carefully cleaned and dried after each use to prevent rust that could render them useless. William spent almost as much time maintaining his tools as using them, a maintenance schedule that became even more demanding during muddy seasons. Weather prediction became a matter of survival. William developed an almost supernatural ability to read subtle changes in cloud patterns, wind direction, and air pressure that might indicate coming rain. A sudden shower could transform a merely difficult working day into an impossible one, stranding workers in fields where movement became literally impossible. The economic implications of muddy conditions were severe. Peasants who couldn't complete their agricultural tasks on schedule faced fines from their lords, potential loss of their holdings, and the very real prospect of starvation if their crops failed. The mud wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat to survival that could push families from subsistence into destitution with a single bad season. But medieval peasants developed remarkable strategies for coping with these conditions. They learned to work in shorter bursts, conserving energy for the most critical tasks. They developed techniques for carrying heavy loads across muddy terrain, using wooden boards and poles to distribute weight and create temporary walkways. They timed their work to take advantage of brief periods when conditions were marginally better, often working by moonlight when the nighttime. Cooling had firmed the soil slightly. The clothing worn for fieldwork reflected these muddy realities. Peasants wore their oldest, most expendable garments for agricultural work, knowing that anything worn into the fields would be permanently stained and probably damaged. Layers became important not just for warmth, but for the ability to shed. Mud-soaked outer garments when moving between different types of work. As William trudges home at the end of another grueling day, his legs caked with mud from ankle to thigh. His tools cleaned and stored for tomorrow's battle, one has to wonder, what psychological impact did this constant struggle with mud have on the medieval peasant psyche? How did it shape their understanding of their place in the world, their relationship with nature, and their expectations of what life could offer? By the time William reached his 40th year on advanced age for a medieval peasant, he had developed what could only be described as a philosophy of mud. This wasn't a formal system of thought, but rather a deeply practical understanding of how to live productively and, in its own way, contentedly within an environment that seemed designed to test human adaptability. His feet, permanently stained brown from decades of contact with waterlogged soil, had become instruments of remarkable sensitivity, capable of reading terrain with the precision of a surveyor. The wisdom that medieval peasants developed around muddy conditions represented one of humanity's earliest forms of environmental adaptation. They understood concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for centuries. Soil composition, drainage patterns, the relationship between organic matter and soil structure, and the complex interactions between weather patterns and ground conditions. William could tell by the sound his foot made when it hit the ground, whether he was walking on clay-heavy soil that would trap him or sandy loam that would support his weight. He knew that mud mixed with cow manure had different properties than mud mixed with pig waste, and he could adjust his walking technique accordingly. This knowledge wasn't learned from books or formal instruction, it was earned through thousands of hours of direct experience. Each footstep, a small experiment in applied physics. The seasonal rhythms that governed peasant life weren't just about crop cycles, they were about the predictable patterns of mud formation and dissipation. Spring mud was different from autumn mud, not just in temperature, but in composition and behavior. Spring mud, fed by snowmelt and early rains, was typically deeper but more uniform. Autumn mud, created by harvest time rains falling on soil that had been compacted by a season of agricultural activity, was often more treacherous. With firm surfaces hiding unstable layers beneath, medieval peasants developed an extensive vocabulary for describing different types of mud, much as the Inuit are said to have multiple words for snow. There was the thick, black mud of marshy areas that could swallow a person to the waist, the red-brown mud of clay soil that stained everything it touched, but provided relatively stable footing once you learned to work with it, the gray, slippery mud of areas with poor drainage that was impossibly slick but easy to scrape off tools and boots. The construction techniques peasants used for their homes and farm buildings reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about living with mud. The wattle and daub method wasn't chosen arbitrarily, it represented an optimal balance between available materials, structural requirements, and the need to create walls that could flex with seasonal ground movement without cracking. The mixture of mud, straw, and dung created a composite material with properties that exceeded any of its individual components. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was how peasants learned to move through muddy environments with minimal energy expenditure. They developed a distinctive gaita, careful rolling walk that distributed weight evenly and used momentum rather than force to overcome the resistance of soft ground. Children learned this technique naturally, but it required conscious practice. For adults who hadn't grown up in muddy conditions, the social structures of medieval villages evolved partly in response to muddy conditions. The layout of settlements reflected practical considerations about drainage and access during wet periods. Main pathways were positioned to take advantage of natural ridges and areas of better drainage. Community resources, like wells and mills, were located not just for convenience, but for accessibility during the muddy seasons when movement became difficult. Economic relationships also adapted to muddy realities. The timing of markets and fairs took into account seasonal road conditions. Trades and professions developed specializations. Related to dealing with mud, there were craftsmen who specialized in making wooden pattens overshoes designed to keep feet out of the worst mud, and others who focused on waterproofing techniques for clothing and equipment. The medical understanding of the time recognized mud as both a health hazard and, occasionally, a remedy. Peasants knew that certain types of mud could cause skin conditions and infections, but they also used mud poultices to treat injuries and inflammations. This practical pharmacology was based on centuries of observation and experimentation, passed down through generations of healers and midwives. But the greatest adaptation may have been psychological. Medieval peasants developed a relationship with mud that transcended simple tolerance or resignation. They found ways to take pride in their ability to function effectively in conditions that would challenge anyone. There was a quiet dignity in the way a skilled peasant could cross a muddy field without losing their footing, in the precision with which they could predict when field conditions would be suitable for particular types of work. The religious and cultural frameworks of medieval life provided context for understanding mud that went beyond the merely practical. Mud was associated with humility, with the recognition that humans were, quite literally, creatures of earth and water. The phrase "from dust to dust" took on immediate, practical meaning for people who spent their lives intimately connected to soil in all its forms. Children growing up in this environment developed different relationships with cleanliness and comfort than modern people might expect. They learned to distinguish between the kind of mud that was merely dirty and the kind that was genuinely harmful. They developed tolerance for levels of discomfort that would seem extreme today. But they also learned to find satisfaction and even joy in small comforts that were available to them. The end of winter was particularly significant in mud-dominated communities. The first days when the ground began to firm up after months of soggy conditions were occasions for genuine celebration. People could move freely again, visit neighbors. Without major expedition planning, it began the agricultural work that would determine their survival for another year. As William sits by his fire on a cold March evening in 1343, carefully cleaning the mud from his tools and preparing for another day in the fields, he represents something remarkable in human history, a person who has achieved mastery over one of nature's most challenging environments using nothing but intelligence, experience, and determination. His mud-stained feet and calloused hands tell the story of a life lived in intimate partnership with forces beyond human control, but not beyond human adaptation. The legacy of these medieval peasants extends far beyond their immediate historical period. Their techniques for managing muddy conditions influenced agricultural practices that continued for centuries. Their understanding of soil behavior laid groundwork for later developments in farming technology. Most importantly, their demonstration that humans could live productively and find meaning in even the most challenging environmental conditions established patterns of adaptation that continue to serve humanity today. When we consider the challenges facing our own era, climate change, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, there may be wisdom to be found in studying how medieval peasants developed sustainable relationships with their difficult environment. They created lives of dignity and purpose while literally immersed in mud. And their example suggests that human adaptability and resilience have depths we are only beginning to understand. You are standing in the workshop of Marcus Fabricius, a cobbler in the Suburra district of Rome in the year 163 AD. And the smell of tanned leather mingles with the less pleasant odors of urban life that drift through the narrow streets. But Marcus isn't crafting elegant sandals for senators or delicate slippers for patrician wives. His specialty is something far more humble, yet infinitely more practical. Carbottone, the perforated leather shoes that keep Roman peasants connected to the earth without drowning in it. The carbottone spread across Marcus's workbench tell a story of ingenious adaptation to environmental challenges that would be familiar to any modern engineer studying drainage systems. These aren't shoes in the modern sense, they're more like leather gloves for feet, carefully crafted with strategic perforations that allow water to flow through while still providing protection from stones, thorns, and the worst of the mud that dominates rural Roman life. Each pair represents hours of skilled labor, but not the kind of craftsmanship that creates objects of beauty. This is utilitarian design at its most pragmatic, every hole and seam placed with consideration for function over form. The leather, about 2 millimeters thick, has been treated with palm oil, animal fat, and beeswax, not for luxury, but for the practical purpose of making it supple enough to move with the foot while remaining tough enough to withstand constant contact with rough terrain. Marcus learned his trade from his father, who learned it from his father before him, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge about how to create footwear for people who can't afford to have their feet dry. The perforations aren't random, they're placed according to principles developed over generations of trial and error. Too many holes, and the shoe provides no protection. Too few, and water accumulates inside, creating conditions worse than going barefoot. The process begins with selecting the right hide. Not just any leather will work for carbottone. The hide must be flexible enough to conform to the foot's movement, but dense enough that the perforations won't tear under stress. Marcus can tell by touch whether a piece of leather has the right grain structure, the proper balance of oils, the correct thickness that will allow him to create holes without weakening the overall structure. Creating the perforations requires tools that Marcus has made himself falls and punches designed to create clean holes without fraying the leather's edges. Each hole must be large enough to allow water flow, but small enough to prevent stones and debris from entering. The pattern of holes reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge about how water moves through confined spaces. Though Marcus wouldn't think of his work in those terms, but the real artistry lies in understanding how the foot moves inside a perforated shoe. Unlike modern footwear with rigid soles and structured support, carbottone move with the foot, flexing and adjusting with each step. The perforations must be placed to accommodate this movement. Holes that align properly when the foot is flat might become stressed and tear when the foot bends. Marcus works mostly with measurements. He's memorized rather than formal patterns. Each customer's feet are unique, and the carbottone must be fitted individually to provide optimal performance. A loose fit allows too much debris to enter through the holes. A tight fit prevents proper water drainage and can cause the leather to split at stress points. The customers who come to Marcus's shop represent the backbone of Roman society, farm workers who tend the vast agricultural estates that feed the empire. Construction laborers who build the roads and aqueducts that define Roman civilization. Craftsmen whose work requires them to spend long hours standing on stone floors or muddy ground. These are people for whom footwear isn't a fashion statement, but a tool essential for survival. Consider Gaius Valerius, a peasant farmer who works a small plot on the outskirts of Rome. His daily routine begins before dawn, when he must check his animals and assess the condition of his fields. The carbottone on his feet have been with him for 3 months, a lifetime for footwear that must endure constant exposure to mud, water, and abrasive surfaces. Gaius's carbottone tell the story of his working life through their wear patterns. The holes near the toes show signs of enlargement from repeated contact with rocks and roots. The leather around the heel has developed a patina from constant friction. Most tellingly, the perforations have taken on individual characteristics, some slightly larger than others, some partially blocked with accumulated debris, each reflecting the specific demands of Gaius's daily activities. But the genius of carbottone isn't just in their construction, it's in how they change the wearer's relationship with muddy environments. Unlike solid shoes that create an adversarial relationship between foot and mud, carbottone establish a partnership. The mud flows through, around, and past the foot. But it doesn't accumulate in the way that turns footwear into heavy, waterlogged anchors. Gaius has learned to read the feedback his carbottania provide about ground conditions. The way water flows through the holes tells him about soil moisture levels. The amount of debris that enters gives him information about the terrain ahead. The temperature of mud against his skin provides early warning about changing weather conditions that might affect his work plans. This intimate connection with the ground surface influences how Roman peasants navigate their environment. They develop enhanced sensitivity to variations in terrain that people wearing solid shoes would never notice. A slight change in the firmness of mud beneath their feet can alert them to hidden obstacles, changes in soil composition, or the presence of underground water sources. The social implications of wearing carbottone are complex. On one hand, they mark the wearer as someone who works with their hands and feet, someone whose livelihood depends on direct contact with the earth. In Roman society's rigid class structure, this carries implications about social status and economic position. Centaurs don't wear carbottone. They wear elegant sandals that elevate them literally and figuratively above the mud of daily labor. But there's also a practical pride associated with well-made, well-maintained carbottone. Gaius takes satisfaction in the way his shoes perform their function, in the knowledge that they're precisely suited to his needs. There's craftsmanship in learning to use them effectively, skill in maintaining them properly, and even artistry in the way an experienced wearer can move through challenging terrain with apparent ease. The maintenance of carbottone requires daily attention. Each evening, Gaius carefully cleans debris from the perforations, using small sticks or thorns to clear blocked holes, inspects the leather for signs of wear that might lead to tears, treating problem areas with whatever oils or fats are available. This isn't vanity, it's practical maintenance of tools, essential for survival. The seasonal cycles of Roman agriculture place different demands on carbottone throughout the year. Spring planting requires long hours standing in muddy fields, testing the shoe's drainage capabilities to their limits. Summer harvesting creates different challenges, as dried mud and plant debris can clog the perforations. Autumn's grape harvest exposes the shoes to acidic juices that can affect the leather's properties. Winter's relative dormancy provides time for repairs and replacement. As Marcus puts the finishing touches on another pair of carbottone, carefully testing each perforation to ensure proper drainage. He's participating in a tradition that connects Roman technology to the fundamental human challenge of staying mobile in muddy conditions. His work represents a solution to problems that have faced agricultural societies since the beginning of civilization, and his craftsmanship ensures that Roman peasants can continue the essential work of feeding an empire. But one must wonder, what thoughts occupy the mind of a man whose life's work is creating holes in leather? How does Marcus understand his place in the vast machinery of Roman society? And what does his intimate knowledge of peasant footwear tell him about the lives of the people who wear his creations? The Roman road system, celebrated as one of history's greatest engineering achievements, looks different when you're experiencing it through the perforated soles of Carbetine. Gaius Valerius finds himself walking the Via Appia on a gray morning in 186 AD, carrying a load of grain to market in Rome, and every step reminds him that the empire's infrastructure is designed for different feet than his. The famous Roman roads, with their multiple layers of carefully fitted stones, represent the pinnacle of engineering for wheeled traffic and military movement. But for a peasant in Carbetane, these roads create their own unique challenges. The gaps between the large paving stones collect water, mud, and debris, creating treacherous footing for someone whose shoes are designed to let water through rather than keep it out. Gaius has learned to read Roman roads like a sailor reads the sea. The crown of the road, built higher in the center to encourage water runoff, provides the most stable footing, but it's also where the heaviest traffic concentrates. Walking there means constantly dodging carts, pack animals, and the occasional official courier whose passage takes priority over everyone else's. The edges of the road offer more room to maneuver, but they're also where water accumulates, and where the paving stones are most likely to be loose or missing. The Carbetone on Gaius's feet have developed a relationship with Roman road surfaces that goes beyond simple protection. Each type of stone creates different challenges. The basalt paving stones of major roads are smooth but slippery when wet, requiring a careful, shuffling gait that maintains constant contact with the surface. The rougher limestone used for secondary roads provides better traction, but wears down the leather more quickly. Gravel surfaces offer the best drainage for his perforated shoes, but allow small stones to enter through the holes. But Roman roads are just part of a vast transportation network that peasants like Gaius must navigate daily. The paths between farms, the tracks that lead to markets, the routes that connect rural settlements to urban centers, all of these present their own muddy challenges that Carbetone must address. Consider the typical journey from Gaius's farm to the local market, a distance of perhaps 15 miles that represents a major expedition requiring careful planning and preparation. The route begins on a dirt path that serves several small farms, a track that has been worn smooth by generations of traffic but turns into a muddy canal during wet weather. Gaius's Carbetone immediately begin doing their job, allowing water and thin mud to flow through while keeping his feet protected from the worst stones and debris. The path connects to a secondary road surfaced with gravel and broken stone. It's an improvement that provides better drainage, but creates new challenges. The loose stones can enter through the perforations in his shoes, requiring frequent stops to remove them. Gaius has developed a technique for this quick motion that lifts the foot and shakes it to dislodge debris without removing the shoe entirely as the secondary road approaches the main highway. Gaius encounters other travelers whose footwear choices reflect their social and economic positions. Merchants wear enclosed boots that protect their feet completely but would be unbearably hot and waterlogged in agricultural work. Slaves are often barefoot, their owners calculating that the cost of footwear exceeds its benefit. Military personnel wear heavy sandals designed for long marches on good roads but unsuitable for working in muddy fields. The social dynamics of Roman roads become apparent in how different types of travelers interact with the infrastructure. Those in wheeled vehicles stick to the best maintained surfaces, while pedestrians spread out across the full width of the road to find footing suited to their particular footwear. Gaius and other peasants wearing carbatane naturally gravitate toward areas where water drainage is good, but footing remains stable off in the shoulders of the road where runoff has created firm but not rocky surfaces. Weather transforms the entire character of road travel. A sudden shower turns the dust of summer roads into slippery mud that clogs the perforations in carbatane and makes every step treacherous. Winter brings different challenges as frozen mud creates surfaces that are simultaneously slippery and abrasive, wearing down leather while providing unpredictable footing. Gaius has learned to predict weather changes through his feet. The way moisture begins to seep through his carbatane tells him about humidity levels and approaching storms long before clouds become visible. The temperature of mud against his skin provides early warning of freezing conditions that might make travel dangerous. This sensitivity to environmental conditions, developed through constant contact with the ground, gives peasants advantages in weather prediction that their social superiors, insulated by better footwear, don't possess. The economic implications of footwear choices become apparent during long journeys. Gaius's carbatone, despite their utility, won't last more than 4 or 5 months under heavy use. The constant contact with abrasive surfaces, the stress of drainage holes, and the flexibility required for effective mud navigation all contribute to relatively rapid wear for a peasant whose entire annual income might equal the cost of a patrician's single pair of sandals. Footwear represents a significant and recurring expense, but Roman peasants developed strategies for extending the life of their carbatone. Gaius carries repair materials, thin leather patches that can be sewn over enlarged holes, animal fat for waterproofing, and small tools for clearing blocked perforations. He's learned to alternate between different pairs of shoes when possible, allowing each to dry thoroughly between uses to prevent the leather from becoming waterlogged and weak. The military aspects of Roman society also influence civilian footwear. The famous hobnailed sandals of the legions are designed for maximum durability during long marches, but they're unsuitable for agricultural work. However, peasants often salvage metal elements from discarded military footwear to reinforce their own shoes. Gaius has incorporated small metal plates into the soles of his carbatone, extending their life while maintaining their drainage capabilities. Regional variations in Roman footwear reflect local environmental conditions and available materials. In the provinces where Roman technology meets local traditions, hybrid designs emerge. Gallic peasants combine Roman perforated leather techniques with Celtic waterproofing methods. Germanic communities adapt carbatone designs to colder, wetter conditions by adding fur linings that don't interfere with drainage. The urban-rural divide in Roman society is reflected in footwear choices. City dwellers can afford to prioritize protection and comfort over drainage because they primarily walk on paved surfaces with good water management. Rural populations must choose footwear that functions effectively in unpredictable, often muddy conditions where drainage becomes the primary consideration. As Gaius reaches his destination, his carbatone muddy and worn from the journey, but still functional, he represents a triumph of practical engineering over social pretension. His shoes may not be elegant, but they've successfully transported him across varied terrain in changeable weather conditions while maintaining the connection to ground conditions that his work requires. The market where Gaius sells his grain brings together people wearing every type of footwear available in the Roman world. The contrast between his practical carbatone and the elaborate sandals of wealthy customers reminds everyone present of the social hierarchies that define Roman society. But it also demonstrates the sophisticated technological solutions that Roman craftsmen developed for different environmental challenges. Yet as Gaius prepares to return home, his day at the market completed, he faces a decision that reveals the deeper complexities of peasant life in Roman society. The afternoon rains have begun, transforming the roads into treacherous waterways that will test his carbatone to their limits. Should he wait for conditions to improve, losing valuable daylight and potentially spending money on lodging he can't afford? Or should he trust his footwear and his hard-earned knowledge of muddy travel to carry him safely home? The choice reflects a fundamental reality of peasant existence, the constant calculation of risk versus necessity that shapes every decision. Gaius's Carbatoni aren't just shoes the foundation of his economic survival, the tools that enable him to maintain the mobility essential for his livelihood. Without them, he would be trapped by weather, isolated by mud, unable to participate in the market economy that provides his family sustenance. The afternoon journey home becomes a masterclass in the practical application of Carbatoni technology. As Gaius navigates increasingly muddy roads, his shoes perform exactly as designed. Water flows through the perforations rather than accumulating inside. Debris passes through rather than building up, and his feet maintain the ground contact necessary for stable movement. The journey is uncomfortable, but possible, a victory of practical engineering over environmental challenges. By the 4th century AD, as the Roman Empire faced increasing pressures from barbarian invasions and internal political instability, the humble Carbatoni had evolved into something approaching perfection within their narrow specialization. Gaius Valerius, now an elderly man whose feet had carried him through for decades of muddy Roman roads, had become a living repository of knowledge about the relationship between human mobility and environmental adaptation. The Carbatoni on Gaius's feet in 398 AD represented the culmination of centuries of refinement. Every aspect of their design reflected accumulated wisdom about how to maintain human mobility in challenging conditions. The leather, sourced from cattle raised on specific pastures, known to produce hides with optimal grain structure, had been processed using techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen. The perforations followed patterns that had been tested and refined through countless iterations, each hole positioned with mathematical precision that would impress modern engineers. But the true sophistication of Carbatoni lay not in their construction, but in how they changed the wearer's relationship with the environment. After decades of wearing perforated shoes, Gaius had developed sensory capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. He could identify different types of soil by the way they felt against his feet through the holes. He could predict weather changes hours in advance by monitoring subtle changes in ground temperature and moisture. He could navigate in complete darkness by reading variations in terrain. Through his enhanced tactile sensitivity, this heightened environmental awareness had practical applications that extended far beyond simple mobility. Roman agriculture depended on detailed knowledge of soil conditions, drainage patterns, and seasonal variations in ground moisture. Peasants wearing Carbatoni developed into walking instruments for measuring these variables, their feet serving as sophisticated sensors that could detect changes imperceptible to those wearing solid footwear. The social implications of this enhanced environmental sensitivity were profound. In a society increasingly dominated by urban elites who had little direct contact with agricultural realities, peasants wearing Carbatoni possessed knowledge that was both essential and undervalued. They understood soil science before it existed as a formal discipline, hydrology before it was recognized as an engineering specialty, and meteorology before it became a scientific pursuit. Consider the expertise that Gaius had developed in reading water flow patterns through his Carbaton. When he walked across a field, the way water moved through the holes in his shoes told him about subsurface drainage, soil compaction, and the presence of underground streams or springs. This knowledge was crucial for effective agriculture, but it was knowledge that could only be acquired through years of direct experience with perforated footwear. The construction techniques for Carbatoni had also evolved to reflect deeper understanding of material science. By the late Empire, craftsmen knew that leather from different parts of the hide had different properties. Belly leather was more flexible, but less durable. Back leather was stronger, but less comfortable. They understood how different tanning methods affected the leather's response to repeated wetting and drying. They had developed techniques for treating leather that made it naturally resistant to bacterial growth, reducing the health risks associated with constantly damp footwear. The hole patterns themselves had become increasingly sophisticated. Early, Carbotinets featured simple, regularly spaced perforations. Later versions incorporated complex patterns that optimized drainage while maintaining structural integrity. Some designs featured larger holes near the toes where debris was most likely to enter. Smaller holes around the heel where support was more important. And strategic reinforcements around high-stress areas. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of specialized Carbotinets for different types of work. Farmers required shoes optimized for agricultural tasks, maximum drainage, good ground sensitivity, and durability under constant flexing. Construction workers needed versions that prioritized protection from sharp objects while maintaining enough drainage for work in wet conditions. Messengers and other travelers required Carbotinets, designed for long-distance walking on varied terrain. The regional variations in Carbotinet design reflected local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. In the wet climate of Britain, Roman-influenced designs incorporated wool linings that absorbed moisture while maintaining drainage. In the hot, dry conditions of North Africa, perforations were larger and more numerous to maximize cooling. In mountainous regions, sole designs were modified to provide better traction on rocky terrain. The maintenance of Carbotin had evolved into a sophisticated craft in its own right. Gaius's evening routine included not just cleaning and inspection, but careful monitoring of wear patterns that could predict failure points. He knew exactly how many miles his shoes had traveled, which types of terrain caused the most wear, and when replacement would become necessary. This predictive maintenance was essential for peasants who couldn't afford unexpected footwear failures. During critical agricultural periods, the economic systems surrounding Carbotinet production reflected the shoe's importance in Roman society. Specialized craftsmen focused exclusively on peasant footwear, developing supply chains that provided consistent access to appropriate leather and other materials. Regional workshops standardized designs while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to local conditions. Even the Roman military recognized the value of Carbotinet-trained personnel, incorporating peasant recruits whose enhanced ground sensitivity made them valuable for reconnaissance and engineering tasks. But the greatest achievement of Carbotinet may have been their role in maintaining human dignity under challenging conditions. Gaius, despite his low social status and limited economic resources, possessed skills and knowledge that enabled him to navigate his environment with competence and even grace. His muddy feet and simple leather shoes represented not poverty or degradation, but mastery of technologies that allowed him to maintain mobility and productivity regardless of environmental conditions. The religious and philosophical implications of this relationship with the earth weren't lost on Roman peasants. The constant contact with soil through perforated shoes created a literal connection with the ground that supported all life. This connection influenced how peasants understood their place in the natural world and their relationship with the forces that governed agricultural success or failure. As the Western Roman Empire entered its final century, the practical wisdom embodied in Carbotinet design represented one of Rome's most successful but least celebrated technological achievements. These simple perforated shoes had solved fundamental problems of human mobility in challenging environments, creating solutions that enabled agricultural productivity and economic exchange even. Under adverse conditions, the legacy of Carbotin extended far beyond their immediate practical applications. The design principles they embodied the integration of drainage with protection, the optimization of materials for specific environmental challenges, the development of regional variations to address local conditions influenced footwear design. For centuries after the fall of Rome, medieval peasant shoes incorporated drainage concepts derived from Roman carbetone. Modern athletic shoes use perforations and ventilation systems that echo the innovations of Roman craftsmen. But perhaps, most importantly, carbetone demonstrated that sophisticated technological solutions could emerge from the practical needs of ordinary people. The peasants who wore them weren't engineers or scientists in the formal sense. But they were innovators who developed and refined technologies that addressed real-world problems with remarkable effectiveness. As Gaius sits by his fire on one of his final evenings, carefully cleaning the carbetone that have served him faithfully for so many years, he represents a form of human achievement that rarely finds its way into history books. His muddy, perforated shoes and the knowledge they enabled, created, and sustained the agricultural foundation upon which Roman civilization depended. His quiet mastery of environmental challenges, developed through decades of intimate contact with the earth, embodied a form of wisdom that connected practical necessity with deeper understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The holes in his shoes weren't just engineering solutions. They were windows into a way of life that found dignity and purpose in direct engagement with the most basic challenges of human existence. You are standing in the great hall of a Norse farmstead in the Orkney Islands during the winter of 947 AD, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the warmth of the central fire, or the smell of cooking food eats, the sight of feet. Dozens of bare feet, some wrapped in strips of wool or linen, others completely exposed, all belonging to people who have learned to navigate one of the world's most challenging environments without what we would consider the most basic protection. Ingvar Eriksson, a Bondi or free farmer, sits on a wooden bench, examining his feet with the careful attention of a craftsman inspecting his tools. After 32 winters in the North Atlantic, his feet have become something far beyond mere appendages. They're specialized instruments, adapted through necessity and hardened through experience into devices capable of functions that would seem impossible to the modern mind. The soles of Ingvar's feet tell the story of his adaptation to Northern European conditions. The skin has thickened into natural leather, developing calluses and precise patterns that correspond to the terrain he navigates most frequently. The heel shows the deep, hard ridges that come from years of walking on rocky shorelines. The ball of the foot displays the broad, tough pad that develops from constant contact with uneven forest floors. Even his toes have adapted, developing thick skin on their undersides and enhanced gripping ability that allows him to maintain purchase on slippery surfaces. But this adaptation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without cost. Ingvar's feet bear the scars of his education in barefoot survival white lines where frostbite claimed small sections of skin, rough patches where repeated injury has built up protective tissue, and the subtle deformations that come from years of compensating for damaged areas. Each mark represents a lesson learned, a survival strategy developed, a small victory in the ongoing battle between human vulnerability and environmental extremes. The process of developing cold-resistant feet begins in childhood in these northern communities. Children are gradually exposed to cold surfaces, starting with brief periods and slowly building tolerance. By the age of 10, most children can walk comfortably on snow for short distances. By 15, they've developed the circulation patterns and tissue adaptations that allow for extended barefoot activity, even in severe conditions. This isn't simply a matter of toughening up. It's a comprehensive physiological adaptation that involves changes in blood flow patterns, nerve sensitivity, and even the structure of blood vessels in the extremities. Northern European peasants developed enhanced circulation to their feet, allowing them to maintain warmth and binge function even when surface temperatures would seem to make such activity impossible. The techniques for barefoot winter survival that Ingvar has mastered represent centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of people who had no choice but to adapt or perish. He knows exactly how long he can stand on snow before tissue damage begins about 12 minutes at -10 degrees Celsius if he's stationary. Much longer if he maintains movement. He understands the warning signs of dangerous cold exposure. The initial sharp pain that indicates immediate threat, the numbness that signals the need for immediate warming, and the subtle tingling that tells him his circulation is responding appropriately to cold stress. But perhaps most importantly, Ingvar has learned to read environmental conditions through his feet with extraordinary precision. The way snow feels beneath his soles tells him about air temperature, humidity levels, and weather patterns with accuracy that rivals modern meteorological instruments. Packed snow feels different from powder. Ice has its own distinct signature, and wet conditions create sensations that provide immediate information about changing weather patterns. The clothing strategies that complement barefoot survival in Northern Europe reflect sophisticated understanding of heat conservation and moisture management. Ingvar wears multiple layers of wool, but his leg coverings stop well short of his feet. This isn't an oversight, it's a deliberate design choice that prevents the formation of ice dams where clothing meets skin, a common cause of frostbite in less experienced individuals. The social aspects of barefoot life in medieval Northern Europe create dynamics that are difficult for modern people to understand. Going barefoot isn't a sign of poverty or neglect, it's a practical adaptation to environmental conditions that makes other forms of footwear impractical or even dangerous. In communities where everyone navigates winter conditions barefoot, the ability to do so effectively becomes a mark of competence and maturity. Children in these communities view the development of cold-resistant feet as a rite of passage. The first time a child can walk across a frozen stream barefoot without visible distress marks. Their transition from dependent to capable community member. Adults take pride in their ability to work outside in conditions that would incapacitate those without proper foot conditioning. The economic implications of barefoot survival are significant in these resource-scarce environments. Leather that might be used for footwear can instead be devoted to more critical applications: toolmaking, food storage, clothing for areas of the body that can't be adapted to cold exposure. The time and materials that other cultures invest in footwear can be redirected toward other survival priorities, but the practice also creates vulnerabilities that must be carefully managed. Injuries to unprotected feet can be devastating in environments where healing is slow and infection risks are high. Ingvar has learned to inspect his feet daily for cuts, abrasions, or signs of developing problems that could compromise his mobility. He maintains a collection of natural remedies, animal fats for moisturizing, plant-based antiseptics for wound care, and techniques for wrapping injured feet that maintain protection without interfering with the sensory feedback essential for safe navigation. The seasonal rhythms of Northern European life are profoundly influenced by the realities of barefoot existence. Summer is a time of recovery, when feet can heal from winter damage and build up resources for the challenging months ahead. Autumn requires careful preparation, gradually reintroducing feet to cold conditions and building up tolerance levels. Spring brings its own challenges as thawing conditions create unpredictable surfaces that test even the most experienced. Barefoot travelers. Winter itself is divided into phases that require different survival strategies. Early winter, when temperatures hover around freezing, can actually be more dangerous than deeper cold, because wet conditions increase heat loss and create slippery surfaces. Midwinter's deep cold is harsh but predictable, allowing experienced individuals to plan activities around known limitations. Late winter brings the particular challenges of freeze-thaw cycles that create treacherous conditions, requiring constant vigilance. The navigation techniques that barefoot winter survivors develop go far beyond simple endurance. Ingvar has learned to identify safe paths across frozen surfaces by the way they feel through his feet. Solid ice provides one type of sensation, while ice over water creates different feedback. snow depth, density, and underlying surface conditions all provide information that influences route selection and movement strategies. The relationship between bare feet and winter. Terrain creates opportunities for activities that would be impossible with conventional footwear. Ingvar can cross ice so thin if we wouldn't support the distributed weight of shoes by moving quickly and reading surface conditions through direct contact. He can climb rocky surfaces in winter conditions by using his toes' enhanced gripping ability. To find purchase on holds that would be unusable with footwear. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of barefoot. Winter survival is the mental adaptation it requires. The constant awareness of environmental conditions, the continuous monitoring of physical status, the split-second decision-making that prevents serious injury, all of these demands create a heightened state of consciousness that influences every aspect of daily life as Ingvar prepares for another day of winter activity. Carefully examining his feet and planning his routes based on current conditions, he represents one of humanity's most remarkable adaptations to extreme environmental challenges. His bare feet aren't a sign of primitive conditions or material deprivation. They're sophisticated biological instruments that enable survival and productivity in conditions that would challenge modern technology. But what psychological landscape emerges from this constant negotiation with cold and discomfort? How does the daily reality of barefoot winter survival shape the mental world of people who have no choice but to adapt or perish? The pre-dawn darkness of a February morning in 1034. AD finds Astrid Olafsdatter preparing for what she knows will be one of the most challenging days of the winter. The temperature outside her family's longhouse has dropped 2 levels that make even the hardiest members of her community think twice about extended outdoor activity. But the sheep in the outlying pasture need attention, and the responsibility falls to her. Astrid's morning ritual of foot preparation has been refined through 26 winters into a precise routine that could mean the difference between productive work and dangerous injury. She begins with strips of wool cloth, each piece carefully selected for its specific properties: thickness, weave density, and moisture-wicking ability. These aren't random scraps of fabric, but specialized components of a survival system that has been developed and perfected over generations. The technique of foot wrapping in medieval Northern Europe represented a sophisticated compromise between protection and mobility. Unlike rigid footwear that creates barriers between foot and ground, wrapping systems maintain the sensory contact essential for safe navigation while providing insulation and protection from the worst environmental hazards. Astrid's wrapping technique begins at the toes, where she creates the most critical junction between protection and sensitivity. The first layer of fine wool is wrapped tightly enough to prevent moisture accumulation but loosely enough to maintain blood circulation. She pays particular attention to the spaces between her toes, areas where moisture can collect and freeze, creating dangerous cold injuries. The second layer focuses on the sole, creating a cushioned barrier against sharp objects and cold surfaces, while maintaining the flexibility essential for reading terrain conditions. This layer uses coarser wool with greater insulating properties, but it must be applied with careful attention to pressure points that could restrict circulation or create uncomfortable bunching during extended walking. The final layer wraps around the ankle and lower leg, creating a sealed system that prevents snow from entering while maintaining the mobility necessary for complex movements. This outer layer must be secured tightly enough to stay in place during vigorous activity, but not so tightly that it restricts the muscle action necessary for balance and agility. But the real art of foot wrapping lies in adapting the technique to specific conditions and activities. Astrid's wrapping for sheep tending, which involves long periods of standing in snow while performing detailed work with her hands, differs significantly from her preparation for wood gathering, which requires extensive walking and climbing. The number of layers, the tightness of the wrapping, and the specific materials used all vary based on the demands of the planned activity. The materials available for foot wrapping in medieval Northern Europe were limited but carefully selected. For optimal performance, wool was the primary choice because of its unique properties. It maintains insulating value even when damp, wicks moisture away from the skin, and creates air pockets that enhance thermal protection. But not all wool was equally suitable. The finest, softest wool went against the skin to prevent chafing, while coarser outer layers provided durability and weather resistance. Linen served specific functions in foot wrapping systems, particularly as an inner layer that could be easily washed and replaced. Its smooth texture reduced friction, and its absorbent properties helped manage moisture buildup. Some communities used thin leather strips as outer layers, providing additional protection against sharp objects while maintaining flexibility. The seasonal variations in foot wrapping techniques reflected the changing demands of Northern European weather. Winter wrapping focused primarily on insulation and protection from cold, using multiple layers and moisture-resistant outer materials. Spring wrapping had to address the challenges of wet conditions and unpredictable temperatures, requiring materials that could handle both ice and slush. Summer brought the luxury of minimal wrapping, but even then, some protection was necessary for extended outdoor work. The social dynamics surrounding foot wrapping skills create hierarchies and relationships that influenced community structure. Experienced wrappers like Astrid served as teachers for younger community members, passing down techniques that could literally mean the difference between life and death. The quality of someone's foot wrapping was a visible indicator of their survival skills and attention to detail. Women often specialized in foot wrapping techniques as part of their broader responsibilities for textile production and household management. They developed expertise in selecting appropriate materials, maintaining wrapping supplies, and adapting techniques for different family members' needs. This knowledge carried significant social weight in communities where survival depended on mastering such practical skills. The daily maintenance of foot wraps required careful attention and planning. Astrid's evening routine includes unwrapping her feet, inspecting both the wrappings and her skin for signs of problems, and preparing fresh materials for the next day's activities. Wet or damaged wrappings must be dried and repaired, while materials that have lost their insulating properties need to be replaced. The washing and care of foot wrapping materials presented particular challenges in medieval Northern European communities. Wool requires careful handling to prevent shrinkage and maintain its insulating properties. Linen can be washed more aggressively, but needs thorough drying to prevent bacterial growth. The timing of washing cycles must be coordinated with weather conditions and activity schedules to ensure that fresh wrappings are always available when needed. Storage of foot wrapping materials reflects their critical importance in daily survival. Astrid maintains several complete sets of wrappings in different stages of readiness, one set in use, one set drying, and one set held in reserve for emergencies. The materials are stored in dry locations protected from rodents and insects that might damage the fibers. The economic implications of foot wrapping systems influenced household resource allocation and trade relationships. Families needed to maintain sufficient quantities of appropriate materials to support all members through the challenging winter months. This requirement influenced decisions about sheep breeding, wool production, and trade relationships with other communities. But foot wrapping was more than just a survival technique. It was an art form that allowed for individual expression within the constraints of practical necessity. Astrid's wrapping style reflects her personality and preferences while maintaining the functional requirements for safety and effectiveness. Some wrappers preferred tight, secure systems that prioritized protection, while others chose looser arrangements that maximized mobility and ground sensitivity. The psychological aspects of foot wrapping rituals provided comfort and confidence. In challenging conditions, the familiar routine of preparing feet for difficult weather served as a form of meditation and mental preparation. The physical act of wrapping created a sense of control and readiness that influenced mental state and performance during challenging activities. Teaching foot wrapping techniques to children represented one of the most critical educational responsibilities. In Northern European communities, children had to learn not just the mechanical aspects of wrapping, but also how to assess conditions, select appropriate materials, and adapt techniques for different situations. This education began early and continued throughout childhood. With gradual increases in responsibility and complexity, the relationship between foot wrapping and other survival skills created integrated systems of environmental adaptation. Astrid's wrapping choices influence her selection of routes, timing of activities, and strategies for managing other aspects of cold weather survival. The feedback from her wrapped feet provides information that influences decisions about shelter, clothing, and activity levels, as Astrid completes her morning foot preparation and steps out into the bitter cold. Her carefully wrapped feet represent hours of accumulated knowledge and skill. Each layer of wool has been positioned with purpose. Every fold and tuck calculated to provide optimal performance under the specific conditions she expects to encounter. But the true test of her wrapping skills lies ahead in the hours of outdoor work that will challenge every aspect of her cold weather survival system. How will her feet respond to extended cold exposure? Will her wrapping choices prove adequate for the demands of the day? And what lessons will she learn that will influence her preparation for tomorrow's challenges? The blizzard that strikes the Shetland Islands in March of 1089 AD isn't just weather, it's a test of every adaptation, every survival skill, every hard-won piece of knowledge that separates life from death in one of Europe's most challenging environments. Thorvald the shepherd finds himself caught in conditions that would kill a less experienced person within hours. But his bare feet and 23 years of northern survival experience become the foundation for one of the most remarkable demonstrations of human adaptability in medieval Europe. The storm arrives with the sudden violence characteristic of North Atlantic weather systems, transforming a routine sheep-gathering expedition into a life-or-death struggle against forces that seem designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance. The temperature plummets to -15 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds reach levels that make forward progress nearly impossible. And snow falls with such intensity that visibility drops to mere meters. Thorvald's initial response demonstrates the integration of skills and knowledge that defines successful barefoot survival in extreme conditions. His feet, already adapted to cold through decades of gradual conditioning, begin implementing automatic responses that don't require conscious thought. Blood flow patterns adjust to maintain core temperature while preserving function in his extremities. His gait changes to maximize contact time with warmer surfaces while minimizing exposure to the coldest snow. His route selection shifts to take advantage of wind patterns and terrain features that provide momentary shelter. But the real test comes when Thorvald realizes that normal survival strategies won't be sufficient for the conditions he faces. The storm is too severe and too persistent for simple endurance. He needs to implement emergency techniques that push the boundaries of what barefoot survival can achieve. The first emergency strategy involves creating temporary foot protection, using materials available in the immediate environment. Thorvald locates a sheep that has died in the storm and uses his knife to remove strips of hide that can be wrapped around his feet. This isn't ideal footwear. The fresh hide is slippery, difficult to secure, and provides limited insulation, but it creates a barrier between his skin and the snow that could make the difference between survival and frostbite. The technique for applying emergency hide wrapping requires skills that go far beyond basic foot protection. The hide must be positioned to provide maximum protection while maintaining the mobility and ground. Sensitivity essential for navigation in blizzard conditions. Thorvald uses strips of his own clothing to secure the hide, creating a system that will stay in place during vigorous movement. but can be quickly adjusted if circulation problems develop. But hide wrapping is only part of Thorvald's emergency survival system. He must also manage his overall heat balance, ensuring that the energy expenditure of movement doesn't exceed his body's ability to generate warmth. This requires constant monitoring of his physical condition and adjustment of his activity level based on feedback from his feet and other extremities. The navigation challenges of blizzard survival test every aspect of Thorvald's environmental knowledge. With visibility reduced to near zero, he must rely on information gathered through his feet to maintain his sense of direction and avoid dangerous terrain features. The way snow feels beneath his wrapped feet tells him about wind patterns, elevation changes, and the presence of obstacles that could provide shelter or present hazards. Thorvald's understanding of microterrain becomes critical for survival. He knows that depressions in the landscape collect blowing snow and create deeper drifts that could trap him. He understands that ridgelines, while more exposed to wind, often have thinner snow cover that makes movement easier. He can identify the subtle changes in ground texture that indicate the presence of rocks, streams, or other features that influence both navigation and safety. The psychological challenges of extreme weather survival require mental strategies that complement physical adaptations. Thorvald must maintain focus and decision-making ability while dealing with pain, discomfort, and the stress of life-threatening conditions. His decades of experience provide a mental framework that allows him to assess risks accurately and make rational choices even under extreme duress. The emergency shelter techniques that Thorvald employs represent the culmination of Northern European survival knowledge. Using his staff and strips of cloth from his cloak, he creates a windbreak that provides just enough protection to rest briefly and assess his situation. The shelter isn't comfortable, it merely reduces heat loss enough to prevent immediate hypothermia while he plans his next moves. But the most remarkable aspect of Thorvald's survival is how his bare feet continue to function as navigation and safety instruments even under extreme conditions. Through the makeshift hide wrapping, he can still detect changes in terrain, identify safer routes, and avoid the most dangerous snow conditions. This sensory capability, developed through decades of barefoot experience, provides advantages that no amount of conventional footwear could match. The physiological adaptations that enable Thorvald's survival go beyond simple cold tolerance. His circulatory system has developed enhanced capacity for warming blood returning from his extremities. His nervous system has adapted to distinguish between dangerous and tolerable levels of cold exposure. His muscle memory includes automatic responses that maintain balance and mobility even when conscious thought is focused on other survival priorities. The social knowledge that supports individual survival becomes apparent in Thorvald's decision-making process. He knows which members of his community are likely to organize search parties and how they will conduct their efforts. He understands the customary routes and timing that will influence where help might appear. This knowledge influences his choices about where to seek shelter and how long to wait before moving to a new location. The community response to Thorvald's disappearance demonstrates the integrated nature of survival in medieval Northern Europe. Search parties are organized using protocols developed through centuries of experience with storm survival. Searchers know the most likely shelter locations, the routes that lost individuals typically follow, and the signs that indicate someone has passed through an area recently. When Thorvald is finally located after 18 hours in the storm, his condition provides a remarkable demonstration of what human adaptation can achieve under extreme conditions. His feet show signs of cold exposure, but no permanent damage. His improvised hide wrapping has stayed in place and provided sufficient protection to prevent frostbite. His core body temperature, while dangerously low, hasn't dropped to levels that would cause permanent harm. The recovery process reveals the sophisticated understanding of cold injury treatment that medieval northern communities had developed. Thorvald's feet are gradually rewarmed using techniques that prevent the tissue damage that can result from too rapid temperature changes. The hide wrapping is carefully removed to assess the condition of his skin. Natural remedies are applied to prevent infection and promote healing of minor cold injuries. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Thorvald's survival is what it demonstrates about the human capacity for adaptation to extreme environments. His bare feet, initially seeming like a vulnerability that would make survival impossible, actually became the foundation for navigation and mobility that enabled his rescue. The sensory capabilities developed through decades of barefoot experience provided information and abilities that couldn't be replicated by any technology. Available to medieval communities, the story of Thorvald's survival becomes part of the oral tradition that preserves and transmits survival knowledge in Northern European communities. The specific techniques he used, the decisions that proved successful, and the mistakes that nearly proved fatal all become part of the educational curriculum that prepares future generations for similar challenges as Thorvald sits by his hearth. A week after his ordeal, carefully tending his feet and reflecting on the experience, he represents something remarkable in human history, the demonstration that with sufficient knowledge, experience, and adaptation, humans can survive and even thrive in environments that seem designed to exceed the limits of human endurance. His bare feet, scarred and toughened by decades of northern winters, tell the story of humanity's capacity to adapt to extreme challenges through knowledge, skill, and determination. They represent not primitive conditions or material deprivation, but the pinnacle of environmental adaptation achieved through generations of accumulated wisdom and individual dedication to mastering the art of survival at the edge of the habitable world. The lessons embedded in Thorvald's experience continue to influence survival practices in northern communities for generations, creating a legacy of environmental adaptation that connects the practical necessities of medieval life with the broader human story of learning to live successfully in the world's most challenging environments. The year 1315 brings changes to the landscape of northern France that seem to mock everything peasants thought they knew about the rhythms of seasons and the predictability of agricultural life. Marie Dubois stands at the edge of her family's small plot near Reims, and the scene before her defies comprehension. Neath the middle of July, yet the ground beneath her bare feet feels more like the muddy chaos of early spring, and the air carries a chill that should belong to October. The Great Famine has begun, though Marie doesn't yet know the name that history will give to this catastrophe. What she does know is that the feudal arrangement that has defined her family survival for generations, 1/3 of the harvest for themselves, 1/3 for seed, 1/3 for their lord, has become impossible to maintain when the harvest itself has become a cruel joke played by weather that no longer follows familiar rules. The little ice age isn't announcing itself with dramatic fanfare. Instead, it creeps into peasant life through subtle changes that accumulate into catastrophe. The growing season, once predictable enough to guide planting decisions passed down through generations, has begun shortening by days, then weeks. The summer warmth that should ripen grain never quite arrives, leaving crops struggling in conditions more suitable for early spring growth. Marie's feet, bare as always during the summer months, register these changes with the sensitivity of precision instruments. The soil temperature that should be warm enough to encourage vigorous plant growth remains stubbornly cool. The moisture levels that should decrease as summer progresses instead maintain the saturated conditions of spring, creating a boggy landscape that makes every agricultural task exponentially more difficult. The muddy conditions that have always been a challenge during planting and harvest seasons have now become a permanent feature of the agricultural landscape. Marie finds herself working in mud that reaches past her ankles, in conditions that would have been considered exceptional just a few years earlier, but are now becoming the norm. The consistency of this mud is different, too colder, more persistent. and somehow more hostile to human activity. The tools that peasants have used for centuries to manage muddy conditions are proving inadequate for the new reality. The drainage techniques that worked when excessive moisture was a temporary problem fail when waterlogged conditions become permanent. The timing strategies that allowed peasants to work around muddy periods break down when every period becomes muddy. Marie's daily routine requires constant adaptation to conditions that would have been unthinkable to her grandparents. Her morning inspection of the family's crops involves navigating terrains so muddy that each step requires careful planning to avoid becoming mired. The paths between fields, once firm enough to support carts and draft animals, have become treacherous. Passages that challenge even the most experienced barefoot travelers. The barefoot mobility that has always been Marie's primary means of navigating agricultural terrain faces new challenges in the cooler, wetter conditions of the Little Ice Age. Her feet, adapted to the seasonal variations of normal medieval weather, must now cope with ground temperatures that remain uncomfortably cold even during summer months. The calloused soles that provided adequate protection against normal seasonal extremes struggle with the persistent chill of mud that never fully warms. But the real transformation lies in how the changed conditions affect the entire system of peasant survival. The agricultural calendar that has guided planting, cultivation, and harvest decisions for centuries becomes unreliable when weather patterns no longer follow historical precedents. Marie finds herself making decisions about crop management based on conditions her family has never experienced, with no accumulated wisdom to guide her choices. The social structures of medieval rural life face unprecedented stress as the environmental changes of the Little Ice Age disrupt the assumptions upon which feudal society depends, when peasant families can't produce the surplus needed to support their obligations to their lords. The entire system of medieval agricultural organization begins to break down. The legal and social frameworks that have defined peasant life for generations prove inadequate for the new reality of persistent crop failures and environmental uncertainty. Marie's experience represents the beginning of a transformation that will ultimately reshape European society. The traditional three-field system of agriculture, with its careful rotation of crops and fallow periods, assumes predictable seasonal patterns that no longer exist. When summer temperatures remain too cool for proper grain ripening and growing seasons become too short for traditional crop cycles, peasants must develop entirely new approaches to agricultural survival. The nutritional challenges created by crop failures compound the physical difficulties of working in constantly muddy conditions. Marie and her family find themselves attempting the same demanding agricultural labor while consuming fewer calories and lower quality food than their bodies require. The combination of inadequate nutrition and increased physical demands from working in difficult conditions creates a downward spiral that threatens the survival of entire communities. The psychological impact of environmental unpredictability affects every aspect of peasant life. Marie has grown up with the confidence that comes from understanding natural cycles, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. The breakdown of these predictable patterns creates anxiety and uncertainty that influences decision-making in ways that often make survival more difficult rather than easier. The regional variations in Little Ice Age impacts create new forms of inequality and social tension. Some areas experience more severe cooling than others, leading to migration patterns that disrupt established community structures. Marie's village begins receiving refugees from more severely affected regions, straining resources that are already inadequate for the local population. The economic implications of persistent crop failures force peasants to seek alternative survival strategies that often conflict with traditional feudal obligations. When agricultural surplus disappears, peasants must choose between meeting their obligations to their lords and feeding their families. These choices create legal and social conflicts that contribute to the broader breakdown of medieval social Structures dot the technologies available to medieval peasants for managing. Muddy conditions prove inadequate for the persistent wetness of Little Ice Age conditions. Traditional drainage techniques designed for seasonal excess moisture can't cope with permanently waterlogged soils. The wooden tools and implements that served adequately under normal conditions rot and break down more quickly in the constantly damp environment. Marie's family begins experimenting with survival strategies that would have been unthinkable under normal conditions. They start harvesting immature grain before it has a chance to rot in the fields, accepting lower nutritional value in exchange for some caloric intake. They begin eating foods previously considered suitable only for animal feed, expanding their definition of edible resources to include plants and preparations that earlier generations would have rejected. The community cooperation that has always been essential for agricultural survival becomes even more critical under Little Ice Age conditions. Marie's village develops new systems for sharing labor and resources, pooling knowledge about which survival strategies work under the changed conditions. These cooperative arrangements often conflict with feudal obligations and property rights, creating tensions that contribute to social instability. The seasonal rhythms that have governed peasant life for centuries lose their reliability as the Little Ice Age progresses. Winter conditions extend well into what should be spring, while summer never achieves the warmth necessary for optimal crop growth. Marie finds herself making agricultural decisions based on immediate conditions rather than seasonal expectations, a shift that requires entirely new forms of environmental knowledge. The clothing and equipment strategies that peasants have developed for managing seasonal cold prove inadequate for the persistent chill of Little Ice Age conditions. Marie's family must maintain winter-level protection for much longer periods, straining resources and requiring adaptations in everything from fuel consumption to food storage techniques, as Marie ends another frustrating day attempting to salvage what she can from crops that seem determined to fail. She represents the beginning of one of history's greatest challenges to peasant survival. The Little Ice Age will test every adaptation, every survival strategy, every piece of accumulated wisdom that European peasants have developed over centuries of agricultural life. But she also represents the beginning of human adaptation to climate change that will ultimately lead to new forms of agricultural technology, social organization, and environmental management. The crisis she faces will force innovations that reshape European society. But the immediate challenge is simply surviving conditions that seem designed to make traditional peasant life impossible. How will Marie and millions like her adapt to environmental changes that threaten the very foundation of medieval agricultural society? What new survival strategies will emerge from the crisis of traditional farming methods? And what lessons from their struggle might apply to our own era's environmental challenges? The winter of 1348 finds Marie Dubois, now a woman of 43 years, standing in what should be her family's grain storage area. But the barrels and sacks that once held the security of a successful harvest contain only the bitter evidence of 3 decades of agricultural failure. The Little Ice Age has settled into the landscape of northern France like an unwelcome permanent resident, transforming not just the weather, but the entire structure of peasant survival. Marie's feet, now bearing the accumulated wisdom of 43 winters in increasingly harsh conditions, have evolved far beyond the simple cold tolerance of her youth. The persistent mud and cold of the Little Ice Age have forced adaptations that previous generations of peasants never needed to develop. Her soles have thickened into natural leather that can withstand longer exposure to cold, wet conditions. Her circulation has adapted to maintain function in feet that spend months in conditions that would have caused frostbite in her ancestors. But the most significant adaptation isn't physicalities, the complete restructuring of survival strategies that Marie and her community have developed in response to environmental conditions that make traditional peasant life impossible. the three-field agricultural system that sustained European peasants for centuries has been abandoned in favor of experimental approaches that prioritize survival over productivity. Marie's family has become part of a movement that historians will later recognize as one of the earliest examples of climate change adaptation in European history. Unable to rely on grain production, they've diversified into survival strategies that were previously considered beneath the dignity of free peasants. They gather wild foods that their grandparents would have scorned. They've learned to preserve and prepare foods using techniques borrowed from the most desperate periods of earlier famines. And they've developed trading relationships that would have violated social norms under normal conditions. The barefoot mobility that once served primarily for agricultural work has been adapted for the expanded survival activities that Little Ice Age conditions require. Marie regularly travels distances that would have been unusual for peasant women of earlier generations, seeking food sources, trading opportunities, and survival resources that aren't available locally. Her feet have become instruments of economic survival as much as agricultural tools. The routes Marie travels reflect the changed geography of Little Ice Age Europe. Traditional roads have become impassable due to persistent flooding and mud, forcing the development of alternative pathways that avoid the worst affected areas. These new routes often cross terrain that previous generations would have considered too difficult or dangerous for regular travel, but the necessities of survival have made such journeys routine. The social implications of these expanded travel patterns create new forms of community, organization, and cooperation. Marie participates in informal networks of information, sharing that connect communities across much wider areas than traditional medieval social structures encompassed. These networks facilitate the exchange of survival knowledge, trading opportunities, and mutual aid arrangements that help communities survive conditions that would be fatal to isolated families. The development of cold-resistant travel techniques represents one of the most remarkable adaptations to Little Ice Age conditions. Marie has learned to extend the duration and distance of barefoot winter travel through techniques that push the boundaries of what seemed possible for unprotected feet. She can now travel for hours in conditions that would have limited her ancestors to minutes of outdoor activity. These extended travel capabilities depend on sophisticated understanding of heat management and risk assessment. Marie knows exactly how to balance activity level with environmental conditions to maintain mobility without triggering dangerous cold injuries. She's developed techniques for warming her feet using body heat, environmental heat sources, and even chemical heat generation through specific types of physical activity. The nutritional strategies that support extended cold weather activity have evolved far beyond traditional peasant diets. Marie and her family have learned to consume foods that provide optimal energy for cold weather survival, often at the expense of palatability or social acceptability. They've discovered that certain combinations of available foods provide better cold resistance than traditional medieval peasant meals. The storage and preservation techniques necessary for Little Ice Age survival require innovations in food technology that represent significant advances over traditional medieval methods. Marie's family has developed techniques for preserving foods in consistently cold, damp conditions that would have caused traditional preservation methods to fail. They've learned to work with the persistent moisture rather than fighting against it's a tool adaptations necessary for survival in constantly muddy conditions have forced innovations in agricultural and domestic technology. Marie uses implements that her great-grandmother wouldn't recognize, tools designed for working in perpetually wet conditions, modified for use by people whose hands and feet must function effectively despite constant cold exposure. The economic relationships that sustain survival under Little Ice Age conditions represent a fundamental departure from traditional feudal arrangements. Marie's family participates in barter networks that operate outside conventional legal and social frameworks. trading goods and services based on immediate survival needs rather than traditional social obligations. The legal and social conflicts created by these survival necessities contribute to the broader breakdown of medieval social structures that characterizes the late medieval period. When survival requires violating traditional social norms and legal obligations, entire communities must choose between law and life. These choices create precedents that ultimately contribute to the transformation of European society. The psychological adaptations required for survival under persistent environmental stress create changes in mental outlook and social behavior that influence community dynamics in complex ways. Marie and her neighbors have developed forms of cooperation and mutual aid that would have been impossible under the more stable conditions of earlier centuries. But they've also experienced social tensions and conflicts that reflect the stress of prolonged survival crisis. The religious and cultural responses to persistent environmental challenge create new forms of community, identity, and meaning-making. Marie's community has developed interpretations of their situation that provide psychological support for survival efforts while maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress. These cultural adaptations become part of the foundation for later European developments in both religious and secular thought, the knowledge, preservation, and transmission systems that ensure survival techniques are passed to future generations. Represent innovations in informal education that go far beyond traditional medieval approaches to knowledge sharing. Marie serves as both student and teacher in networks of practical knowledge that operate outside formal educational institutions. The seasonal variations in survival strategies reflect the adaptation of human behavior to environmental conditions that no longer follow predictable patterns. Marie's annual cycle of activities bears little resemblance to traditional peasant seasonal routines, instead reflecting the practical necessities of surviving in conditions that require constant adaptation to unpredictable environmental challenges. As Marie prepares for what she knows will be another challenging winter, her survival strategies represent the culmination of 3 decades of adaptation to environmental conditions that have fundamentally transformed peasant life. Her techniques for maintaining mobility, finding food, preserving resources, and maintaining community relationships under extreme conditions represent innovations that will influence survival strategies for generations to come. But the broader question remains: how sustainable are these adaptations to extreme environmental conditions? Can human communities maintain the level of constant adaptation and innovation that Little Ice Age survival requires? Or will the persistent environmental stress ultimately overwhelm even the most creative survival strategies? By the winter of 1590, Marie de Boer, rather, her great-great-granddaughter, who carries the same name and the accumulated wisdom of 4 generations of Little Ice Age survival, stands at the threshold of what historians will recognize as a transformed Europe. The barefoot peasant woman examining her feet by candlelight in a cottage that has been rebuilt 3 times to accommodate the changed climate conditions represents not the continuation of medieval peasant life, but its evolutionary successor. The feet that Marie examines have been shaped by nearly 3 centuries of adaptation to Little Ice Age conditions. They bear little resemblance to the feet of medieval peasants from the warm period that ended in the early 14th century. The skin has thickened into natural leather that can withstand conditions that would have been considered impossibly harsh by earlier generations. The bone structure has adapted to provide better support on uneven, constantly shifting ground. The muscle development reflects decades of compensating for terrain that never provides stable, predictable footing. But the most remarkable changes aren't physical there in the entire system of knowledge, social organization, and economic relationships that has evolved to support human survival under conditions that once seemed to make peasant life impossible. Marie's community represents the emergence of early modern European society, forged by environmental pressure into forms that would be unrecognizable to medieval peasants. The agricultural techniques that sustain Marie's community have evolved far beyond traditional medieval farming. The three-field system has been replaced by complex crop rotation schemes that account for shortened growing seasons and unpredictable weather patterns. New crops, many introduced from other climate zones, provide alternatives to grain production that can't be relied upon under Little Ice Age conditions. The economic relationships that support these new agricultural approaches represent the early stages of market capitalism. Marie's family participates in trading networks that span continental distances. Seeking resources and opportunities that aren't available locally, these economic relationships operate according to principles of supply and demand rather than feudal obligation, creating the foundation for economic systems that will define early modern Europe. The technological innovations that make survival possible under Little Ice Age conditions represent significant advances in human adaptation to environmental challenge. Marie's community uses improved heating systems, better food preservation techniques, and more effective cold weather clothing than any previous generation of European peasants. These innovations often incorporate knowledge borrowed from other climate zones and cultures, reflecting the expanded geographical awareness that survival necessity has forced upon European communities. The social structures that organize community life under persistent environmental stress represent fundamental departures from medieval feudal arrangements. Marie's community operates according to principles of mutual aid and collective decision-making that prioritize survival effectiveness over traditional social hierarchies. These arrangements often conflict with existing legal and political frameworks, creating tensions that contribute to the broader transformation of European society. The knowledge systems that preserve and transmit survival techniques have evolved into sophisticated informal educational networks that operate alongside and sometimes in competition with formal institutions. Marie possesses knowledge about climate, agriculture, nutrition, medicine, and social organization that exceeds what would have been available to medieval peasants. But this knowledge exists in practical rather than theoretical forms. The mobility patterns that support survival under Little Ice Age conditions have created new forms of geographic knowledge and cultural exchange. Marie has traveled distances and visited places that would have been unthinkable for medieval peasant women, creating personal experiences that contribute to the expanded geographical awareness characteristic of early modern European culture. The family structures that maximize survival under environmental stress often depart from traditional medieval patterns. Marie's extended family includes relationships and obligations that reflect survival necessities rather than conventional social norms. These family arrangements often provide more effective support for survival under difficult conditions. But they also create social tensions and legal complications. The religious and cultural adaptations that provide meaning and psychological support under persistent environmental challenge have contributed to the religious and cultural transformations that characterize the early modern period. Marie's community has developed forms of religious practice and cultural expression that reflect their experiences of environmental challenge and successful adaptation. The legal and political relationships that govern community life under Little Ice Age conditions often conflict with traditional feudal obligations and royal authority. Marie's community makes decisions and establishes relationships based on survival necessities that may violate existing legal frameworks, contributing to the broader political transformations that define the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. The urban-rural relationships that sustain both agricultural and commercial communities under Little Ice Age conditions represent new forms of economic and social organization. Marie's community maintains trading relationships with urban areas that provide markets for agricultural products while supplying manufactured goods and services that can't be produced locally. The international relationships that support survival through resource sharing and knowledge exchange have contributed to the expanded international awareness and trade relationships that characterize early modern Europe. Marie's community participates in networks of exchange that connect local survival strategies with continental and even global resource flows. The environmental knowledge that supports successful adaptation to Little Ice Age conditions represents advances in practical understanding of climate, ecology, and resource management that contribute to early modern developments in natural science. Marie possesses detailed knowledge about environmental patterns and relationships that, while not organized according to formal scientific principles, reflects sophisticated understanding of natural systems, the technological knowledge that supports survival under challenging environmental conditions includes innovations in agriculture, construction, heating, food preservation, and transportation that contribute to early modern technological development. Marie's community uses techniques and equipment that represent significant advances over medieval technology, though these innovations are often practical rather than theoretical. In nature, the medical knowledge that supports health and survival under environmental stress includes understanding of nutrition, disease prevention, and treatment techniques that represent advances over medieval medical practice. Marie possesses knowledge about maintaining health under difficult conditions that reflects centuries of practical experience with environmental health challenges. As Marie sits by her fire on a cold March evening in 1590, carefully tending feet that have carried her through another Little Ice Age winter, she represents something remarkable in human history: the successful adaptation of human communities to environmental change that initially seemed to threaten the very possibility of civilized life. Her scarred, calloused feet tell the story of human adaptability under extreme environmental pressure. Her knowledge and skills represent the accumulation of nearly 3 centuries of creative problem-solving under conditions that forced innovations in every aspect of human life. Her community represents the emergence of social, economic, and cultural arrangements that will provide the foundation for early modern European civilization. The lessons of Little Ice Age adaptation continue to influence European development long after the climate begins to warm again. The innovations in agriculture, technology, social organization, and international relationships that were forced by environmental necessity become permanent features of European culture. The psychological and cultural adaptations that supported survival under difficult conditions contribute to early modern developments in science, philosophy, and political thought. But perhaps most importantly, Marie and millions like her demonstrated that human communities can successfully adapt to environmental changes that initially appear to make traditional ways of life impossible. Their example provides evidence of human adaptability and creativity under extreme environmental pressure that remains relevant for contemporary discussions of climate change and environmental challenge. The barefoot peasant woman tending her fire represents not the persistence of primitive conditions, but the triumph of human ingenuity over environmental adversity. Her muddy feet and simple cottage conceal innovations and adaptations that transformed European civilization and continue to influence human development today.